Frank O'Sullivan's weathered hands froze mid-signature, the pen trembling above the medical consent form as his daughter's face drained of all color. The $187,000 hospital bill scattered across the cramped room like autumn leaves, but Maggie wasn't looking at the crushing debt that would steal their home. She was staring at something far more terrifying. "Daddy, this isn't melanoma." The words hit Frank like a sledgehammer to his chest. Dr. Mitchell's clipboard clattered to the linoleum floor, her professional composure cracking for the first time in 20 years of oncology practice. Maggie's trembling finger traced the pathology report, her nursing training wrestling with an impossible reality. 3 days ago, that dark mole on her father's back had seemed like their death sentence. Now, as she read the genetic markers that defied every medical textbook she'd ever studied, Frank's faded military tattoo seemed to pulse with new meaning. "Get me the research team. Now. Doctor." Mitchell's command cut through the sterile air like a scalpel. What had they discovered in Frank's DNA? And why did it feel like their salvation had just become something infinitely more dangerous? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months before that terrifying moment in the hospital room, Frank O'Sullivan sat at his kitchen table with the same ritual he'd followed for 45 years. Coffee at 5 in the morning, black as motor oil, strong enough to wake the dead. The Detroit Free Press spread before him, obituaries first, a morbid habit that reminded him he was still breathing while so many of his generation weren't. At 78, Frank carried himself like the auto worker he'd been for 37 years before the plant closed. His hands, scarred from decades of wrestling with stubborn engine parts, still moved with the precision of a man who'd built America's cars when Detroit meant something. The house around him told the story of a life lived fully. Wedding photos with his beloved Patricia, military commendations from Vietnam, Little League trophies from coaching his daughter's teams. Patricia's coffee cup still sat in the cabinet, unwashed since the day she died 3 years ago. Some mornings Frank caught himself setting it out by habit. The numbers on his Social Security check, $1,247 a month, barely covered the basics. Property taxes, utilities, groceries, if he was careful. The house Patricia had loved, with its wraparound porch and garden where she'd grown prize-winning tomatoes, now felt like a beautiful prison. Every creaking board reminded him of repairs he couldn't afford. Every draft through the old windows whispered of heating bills that made him choose between warmth and food. Margaret, Maggie, to everyone who knew her, was his anchor in the storm of loneliness. At 45, she should have been living her own life, maybe married to Tom Bradley, the gentle mechanic who'd been courting her for 2 years. Instead, she'd quit her job as a licensed practical nurse 6 months ago when Frank's arthritis made daily tasks nearly impossible. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, sleeping under the same glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck to the ceiling at age 12. Tom was a good man, patient as Job himself. He'd proposed 3 times, each rejection breaking his heart a little more. "I can't leave Dad now," Maggie would tell him, and Tom would nod and kiss her forehead and wait some more. He'd arrive most evenings with groceries they couldn't afford, pretending he'd bought too much for himself. Frank's pride burned every time Tom's kindness highlighted their poverty. Their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, understood loss better than most. At 82, she'd buried her husband, 2 sons, and a daughter, yet still baked enough cookies to feed half the neighborhood. She'd appear at Frank's door with containers of soup when he forgot to eat, her tiny frame belying the strength that held their crumbling community together. The neighborhood itself was dying. Boarded windows, empty lots where houses once stood, street lights that stayed dark because the city couldn't afford repairs. But pockets of stubbornness remained. People like Frank and Mrs. Chen who'd planted roots too deep to pull up, even as Detroit withered around them. They were survivors, the last guardians of dreams that once built the world's greatest industrial city. Monday morning arrived with the kind of bitter February cold that made Detroit feel like the edge of the world. Frank shuffled toward the bathroom, his joints protesting each step on the worn hardwood floors. The house held on to winter like a grudge, despite the ancient furnace working overtime in the basement. He'd grown accustomed to the chill. Heating bills had taught him that comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford. Maggie appeared in the doorway, towel in hand, her face soft with the patience she'd cultivated through months of caring for him. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you cleaned up before Mrs. Chen brings breakfast." It was their routine. She'd help him with things that had once been private, and they'd both pretend it wasn't slowly killing his dignity. The shower was a testament to his declining independence, grab bars installed where Patricia's shampoo bottles once lived. As warm water cascaded over his shoulders, Frank felt some relief from the arthritis that had been his constant companion since his 70s. Maggie chatted about the weather, the neighborhood news, anything to fill the awkward silence of intimacy between father and daughter. She was soaping his back when her hands suddenly stopped moving. "Daddy." Her voice carried a note he'd never heard before. Sharp, clinical, afraid. "How long has this been here?" Frank craned his neck, trying to see what had caught her attention. "What's that, sweetheart?" "This mole. It's—" She touched something on his back, and he felt the pressure of her finger against his skin. "It's about the size of a quarter, and the edges are really irregular." Frank's stomach dropped, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Just an old age spot, Maggie. Your mother used to say I collect them like stamps." Nothing to worry about. But even as he said it, he remembered his father's warnings about changing spots, the way his generation talked about cancer in whispers, as if saying the word too loud might invite it in. Maggie's nursing training kicked in with mechanical precision. She examined the spot more closely, her fingers tracing its borders. "Dad, this doesn't look like an age spot. It's dark, almost black in some places, and the shape—" She paused, and he could hear her trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "We need to have someone look at this." "No." The word came out harder than he intended. Frank turned around, water dripping from his gray hair, and saw his own terror reflected in his daughter's eyes. "Maggie, honey, we can't afford to get sick, you know that. We're barely keeping the lights on as it is. Dad, this could be serious." "If it's what I think it might be, then we'll deal with it when we have to." Frank reached for his towel, his hands shaking slightly. "Right now, we've got bigger problems than some spot on my back." But Maggie wasn't backing down, her jaw set in the stubborn way that reminded him of her mother. "Bigger problems? Dad, if this is melanoma and we wait, there won't be any other problems to worry about. You could die." The word hung between them like a blade. Frank had been dancing around his mortality for months, feeling his body slow down, his memory occasionally skip. But hearing his daughter say it out loud made it real in a way that terrified him. "I haven't been to a doctor in 8 years, he admitted quietly. "Insurance doesn't cover squat, and what they do cover comes with deductibles we can't afford. Remember when I had that chest pain last spring? The emergency room visit cost us $1,200, and all they did was tell me I was stressed." Maggie's face softened, but her resolve remained firm. "I'll call Tom. He can help us figure out—" "No!" Frank's voice rose, echoing off the bathroom tiles. "I won't be a charity case, Maggie. Not for Tom, not for anybody. I've got my pride, and it's about the only thing I got left that's worth anything." They stood in the steamy bathroom, father and daughter locked in a battle of wills. Frank could see the fight going out of her, replaced by the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. She'd given up her career, her chance at marriage, her own life to take care of him. Now she was asking him to risk their financial survival for his health. "Please, Dad," her voice cracked slightly. "Just a quick look at urgent care." "We'll figure out the money part later." Frank studied his daughter's face, seeing the little girl who used to bandage her dolls when they got hurt. The teenager who'd announced she wanted to be a nurse, the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. Mrs. Chen's voice drifted up from downstairs. She'd arrived with breakfast, as she did every morning since Patricia died. "One quick look," he finally said. "But if it's expensive, we walk out. I won't have them bankrupting us over some old man's hide." Maggie's relief was palpable, but Frank caught something else in her expression. A flicker of hope mixed with dread, as if she already knew this wasn't going to be the simple reassurance they both desperately wanted. The Detroit Community Health Center squatted like a tired old dog on 8 Mile Road, its parking lot pocked with potholes that could swallow a tire. Frank gripped Maggie's arm as they navigated the icy walkway, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Mrs. Chen had insisted on driving them in her ancient Buick, muttering prayers in Mandarin while the heater wheezed lukewarm air. Inside, the waiting room told the story of a healthcare system hanging by threads. Mismatched chairs, fluorescent lights that flickered like dying fireflies, and a receptionist who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. The copay, $200, would overdraft their checking account, but Maggie had already slid her debit card across the counter before Frank could protest. They waited for 3 hours among Detroit's forgotten, elderly folks clutching prescription bottles they couldn't afford to refill, young mothers bouncing feverish babies, workers nursing injuries they'd been ignoring because they couldn't miss another day of pay. Frank counted 17 people ahead of them, each one carrying their own burden of delayed medical care and financial fear. "Mr. O'Sullivan?" The physician assistant couldn't have been older than 25, his scrubs still crisp with the optimism of someone who hadn't yet learned that medicine was often about managing poverty as much as treating disease. Frank shuffled into the examination room, Maggie close behind, both of them rehearsing the speech about keeping costs minimal. "Let's take a look at what's concerning you," the PA said, pulling on latex gloves with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Frank removed his shirt, self-conscious about his age-spotted skin and the way his chest had begun to cave inward with time. The moment the PA saw the mole, his professional demeanor cracked like ice on a spring lake. His face went white, then red, then white again. "Sir, I need to get Dr. Mitchell right now." His voice carried an urgency that made Frank's blood pressure spike and Maggie grab his hand. "What is it?" Frank demanded, but the PA was already out the door, leaving them alone with their racing hearts and the sudden understanding that this wasn't going to be the quick reassurance they'd hoped for. Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered the room like a storm front, all business and barely contained energy. Frank had seen that look before, in the eyes of officers who'd delivered bad news to families back in Vietnam. She examined the mole in silence, her fingers gentle but thorough, occasionally glancing at Frank's face with an expression he couldn't read. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I'm going to be direct with you," she finally said, pulling up a chair so she was at eye level with him. "This needs to be biopsied immediately. The characteristics I'm seeing, the irregular borders, the color variations, the size, these are concerning features that require urgent evaluation." Frank's mouth went dry. "How much is this going to cost, Doc?" Dr. Mitchell's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like pain. "Mr. O'Sullivan, cost is the least of your worries right now. We need to determine what we're dealing with before we discuss treatment options." The biopsy procedure was mercifully quick, but the local anesthetic couldn't numb Frank's growing dread. As Dr. Mitchell worked, she explained that the results would take 48 hours, maybe 72 if the pathologist needed additional testing. Each hour stretched ahead of them, like a lifetime. "Can you come in first thing Thursday morning, Doctor?" Mitchell asked as she bandaged the small wound. Her tone had shifted, becoming more personal, less clinical. "And, Mr. O'Sullivan, do you have any family medical records? Any information about your father or grandfather's health history?" The question struck Frank as odd, but the fear clouding his mind made everything seem strange. "My old man lived to 98, he said. "Strong as an ox right up until a truck hit him crossing the street." "Why do you ask?" Dr. Mitchell exchanged a glance with her assistant that Frank couldn't interpret. "Just being thorough. Sometimes family history can help us understand what we're seeing." The drive home passed in heavy silence. Mrs. Chen kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her weathered hands tight on the steering wheel. Maggie sat beside her father, staring out at the empty lots and boarded buildings that marked their neighborhood's slow death. Frank counted streetlights, anything to keep his mind from wandering to the words Dr. Mitchell hadn't said, the possibilities that hung in the air like smoke. That evening, while Frank pretended to watch television, Maggie disappeared into the basement. He could hear her moving boxes, searching through the family archives Patricia had meticulously maintained. When she emerged 2 hours later, dust in her hair and old photo albums in her arms, her expression was unreadable. "Dad, look at this." She spread a collection of black and white photographs across the coffee table. Images of his grandfather, Thomas O'Sullivan, at various ages. In several photos from his later years, dark spots were clearly visible on the old man's hands and neck. "Grandpa Tom had them too," Frank murmured, studying a photo from 1952. "I remember asking him about those marks when I was little. He just laughed and said they were beauty marks from a long life well lived." Maggie pulled out another photo, Thomas at what appeared to be a family reunion, surrounded by children and grandchildren, his skin bearing the telltale spots. "Dad, if it runs in the family, if it's just normal aging..." Frank wanted to believe it. God, how he wanted to believe it. But the look on Dr. Mitchell's face haunted him. Doctors didn't react that way to normal aging. They didn't schedule emergency biopsies for beauty marks. The next 48 hours crawled by like wounded animals. Frank wrote letters he hoped he'd never have to send, to Maggie, to his nephew Danny in Toledo, to Tom Bradley. He kept them hidden in his dresser drawer next to Patricia's jewelry and the deed to the house, just in case. Maggie threw herself into research, her laptop glowing late into the night as she searched medical websites and cancer statistics. The information she found painted increasingly grim pictures: survival rates, treatment costs, quality of life during chemotherapy. Frank pretended to sleep while she cried quietly in the next room, her sobs muffled by the pillow she pressed to her face. Tom visited Wednesday evening, bringing groceries and the kind of steady presence that had always made Frank grateful for the man who loved his daughter. They sat on the porch despite the cold, drinking beer, and avoiding the conversation they were all thinking about. "Whatever this is," Tom said finally, "you don't face it alone." Frank nodded, but inside, the weight of what was coming pressed down on him like the Michigan winter. Tomorrow, Dr. Mitchell would have answers. Tomorrow, they'd learn whether that spot on his back was going to take everything they had left: his life, their home, Maggie's future, Tom's chance at happiness. Tonight, though, they were still a family with hope. The devastating news hit them like a freight train on Thursday morning. Dr. Mitchell's office felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as she delivered words that would change everything. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Mr. O'Sullivan, but the pathology results indicate an aggressive form of melanoma. Based on the cellular characteristics and the rapid changes we're observing, I'm concerned we're looking at stage 4. Frank's world tilted. Stage 4. He'd heard enough obituaries read at church to know what those words meant. Maggie's hand found his, her fingers ice cold despite the warmth of the office. Dr. Mitchell continued talking about treatment options, clinical trials, palliative care, but Frank heard only fragments through the roar in his ears. The treatment protocol would involve immunotherapy combined with targeted therapy, Dr. Mitchell explained, her voice gentle but clinical. We're looking at approximately 18 months of treatment, with costs ranging from $150,000 to $200,000. The number hit Frank like a physical blow. $200,000. He made $1,200 a month. Even if he lived for 20 more years and spent nothing on food, shelter, or clothing, he couldn't earn that much money. "Doc," he said quietly, "I think you got the wrong patient. I can't afford to have cancer." The insurance nightmare began immediately. Medicare covered basic services but classified the recommended treatments as experimental. Frank's supplemental insurance, a bare-bones policy he'd maintained since retirement, had a lifetime maximum of $50,000, a cap he'd approach after just 2 months of treatment. The hospital social worker, a tired woman named Janet who'd clearly had this conversation too many times, explained their options with the enthusiasm of someone reading from a script. "You can apply for charity care," Janet said, shuffling through forms that seemed to multiply on her desk. "There's also the option of medical bankruptcy, though you'd likely lose your home and most assets. Some patients choose to forego treatment and focus on comfort care." Comfort care. The euphemism for giving up, for dying at home while the disease ate away at whatever time remained. Frank looked at Maggie, saw the way her jaw was set in determination, and knew she'd never accept that option. Over the next 3 days, their small world became a battlefield of phone calls and paperwork. Maggie spent hours on hold with insurance companies, her voice growing hoarse as she argued with representatives who seemed trained to say no to everything. Frank listened from his recliner, feeling his pride crumble with each "I'm sorry, but that's not covered" that echoed through their house. Tom appeared Friday evening with a stack of papers and a guilty expression. "I did something," he said, avoiding Frank's eyes. "I started a GoFundMe page for your treatment." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank's face went through a spectrum of emotions: surprise, gratitude, then something darker. "You did what?" "Frank, listen. You made me a charity case." Frank's voice rose, his hands shaking with something that wasn't weakness. "You put my business on the internet for strangers to pity?" "It's not like that," Tom protested, but Frank was already standing, his movement sharp despite his arthritis. "Take it down. Right now." "Dad, please," Maggie intervened, but Frank turned on her with hurt in his eyes. "You knew about this?" The fight that followed was ugly in the way that only family fights could be. Words chosen specifically to wound, love twisted into weapons. Frank accused Tom of treating him like a pet project. Tom shot back that pride wouldn't cure cancer. Maggie stood between them, tears streaming down her face, begging them to stop. "I won't be your pity project," Frank shouted at Tom. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 17 years old. I don't need some mechanic thinking he's going to save me." Tom's face went white. "Some mechanic? Frank, I love your daughter. I've been trying to marry her for 2 years, but she won't leave you long enough to have a life of her own. And now you're going to die because you're too proud to let people help?" The words hit their target. Frank's anger collapsed into something rawer, more painful. He looked at Maggie, really looked at her, and saw what he'd been too selfish to acknowledge. The gray threading through her hair, the lines around her eyes, the way she'd aged caring for him. At 45, she should have been planning a wedding, maybe thinking about children. Instead, she was watching her father slowly die, while her own life passed by. Mrs. Chen found them an hour later, Frank alone in his bedroom, Maggie crying at the kitchen table, Tom's truck gone from the driveway. She made tea without asking, the way she had every crisis since Patricia died, and sat with them until the worst of the storm passed. "In China," she said finally, "we have saying, when the tree falls, the forest helps it grow again. You are not tree falling alone." The weekend brought more devastating news. Dr. Mitchell called Saturday morning with results from additional tests. The melanoma was more aggressive than initially thought, already showing signs of spreading to nearby lymph nodes. Treatment needed to begin immediately, within 2 weeks, or they'd lose any chance of containing it. Maggie spent Sunday at the kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills, insurance forms, and printouts from cancer websites. She'd calculated every possible scenario. Selling the house would cover maybe 6 months of treatment. Borrowing against Frank's minimal life insurance might buy them another 2 months. Her small savings account wouldn't even cover a week's worth of medication. "We could move in with Danny in Toledo," she suggested Monday morning, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Sell the house, use the money for treatment." Frank looked around the kitchen where he'd eaten breakfast for 4 decades, where Patricia had canned tomatoes every August, where Maggie had done homework at the same table where she now calculated the cost of keeping him alive. "This house is all I got left of your mother." "Dad, it's just a house." "No," Frank said firmly. "It's not just a house. It's the place where I brought your mother after we got married. It's where we raised you, where she died holding my hand. You sell this house to pay for some treatment that might not even work, and what do we got left?" "What do I got left?" By Tuesday, the GoFundMe page Tom had created was gaining traction despite Frank's protests. Strangers were donating $5 and $10, sharing stories of their own family battles with cancer. The comment section filled with prayers and encouragement, but also with Frank's worst nightmare: pity from people who saw him as a charity case rather than a man who'd worked every day of his life since he was old enough to hold a job. The growing attention brought unexpected complications. A local news reporter called wanting to interview Frank about the human face of healthcare costs. A pharmaceutical company's patient advocate reached out with offers of compassionate use programs that came with strings attached, and legal complications neither Frank nor Maggie understood. Wednesday brought the call that changed everything. Dr. Mitchell's voice sounded different, urgent, excited, confused. "Mr. O'Sullivan, can you come in first thing tomorrow morning? And please, bring any family medical records you have. Any photographs, military service records, anything that might show your father's or grandfather's medical history." "What kind of records?" Maggie asked, taking the phone from Frank's trembling hands. "Anything that shows their skin, their general health, how long they lived. I know this sounds strange, but the pathologist wants to see our original findings again. There's something unusual about your father's case." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Maggie move around downstairs, pulling out boxes of family photographs and documents. The sound of her searching through their history felt like preparation for a funeral, cataloging a life before it ended. Around midnight, she appeared in his doorway with an armload of discoveries. Old military photos showed his grandfather Thomas in uniform, with visible dark spots on his hands and neck. A family reunion picture from 1962 captured Thomas at 95, still standing straight and proud, those same marks clearly visible on his arms. "Dad, look at this." Maggie spread the photographs across his bed like evidence in a case she was trying to solve. "Grandpa Tom had these marks for decades. The family always just called them his old man spots." Frank picked up a photo he'd forgotten existed. Thomas at his 98th birthday party, surrounded by 4 generations of O'Sullivans. The old man's arms and hands were covered in the dark spots, but his eyes were bright, his smile genuine. "He lived until that truck hit him," Frank murmured. "Never sick a day in his life after he turned 70. What if it's not cancer?" Maggie's voice carried a hope that was almost painful to hear. What if these marks are just something that happens to O'Sullivan men when they get older? Frank wanted to believe it, but the fear had taken root too deeply. Honey, doctors don't order emergency biopsies for family traits. That Dr. Mitchell, she's seen enough cancer to know what she's looking at. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, matching Frank's mood as they returned to the clinic. This time, they were ushered directly into Dr. Mitchell's office. No waiting room purgatory. She had the photographs spread across her desk alongside Frank's medical files, her expression intense and focused. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I've been practicing oncology for 15 years, she began, and I've never seen anything quite like this. The cellular structure of your biopsy sample shows characteristics that don't match typical melanoma patterns. The pathologist has consulted with colleagues at University of Michigan, and they're equally puzzled." Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. "Are you saying it's not cancer?" "I'm saying we need more information before we can determine exactly what we're dealing with. The genetic markers we're seeing are unusual. They suggest a hereditary component that's not documented in current medical literature." Maggie leaned forward, her nursing background helping her navigate the medical terminology. "What kind of genetic markers?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Markers that appear to be associated with enhanced cellular repair mechanisms. It's preliminary, but the preliminary findings suggest that what we're seeing might actually be protective rather than harmful." The room spun around Frank. Protective? After 3 days of imagining his own funeral, planning how to spare Maggie the burden of his medical bills, the possibility that this might not be a death sentence felt too impossible to believe. "There's a research team at the University of Michigan that specializes in genetic longevity studies," Dr. Mitchell continued. "They've asked to review your case. If you're willing to participate in their research program, there could be significant compensation involved, enough to cover any medical costs and, well, quite a bit more." Frank's skepticism kicked in, honed by decades of working-class wariness of anything that sounded too good to be true. "What's the catch, Doc?" "The research would involve additional testing, regular monitoring, possibly some experimental procedures. There are risks, but there's also the potential for groundbreaking medical discoveries. You could be helping to unlock secrets about aging and longevity that could benefit millions of people." Maggie's excitement was palpable, but Frank felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. After a lifetime of making choices based on what he could afford rather than what he wanted, the possibility of having options felt overwhelming. "How much time do I have to decide?" "The research team needs an answer within 48 hours. They're flying in from Michigan tomorrow to evaluate potential study participants." As they left the clinic, Frank's mind raced with possibilities and fears. The GoFundMe page had raised $8,000 from strangers who believed in his fight against cancer. What would those people think if they learned he might not be dying after all? What would Tom think? What would he think of himself? The drive home was different this time, filled with cautious hope instead of crushing despair. But Frank had lived long enough to know that hope could be the cruelest emotion of all, especially when it came wrapped in promises that seemed too good to be true. Friday arrived with a team of researchers from the University of Michigan that looked more like corporate executives than medical professionals. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, the lead geneticist, wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Frank's monthly income, and her assistant carried a briefcase that seemed to contain the secrets of the universe. They transformed Dr. Mitchell's modest office into something resembling a war room, laptops and testing equipment covering every available surface. "Mr. O'Sullivan, Dr. Hartwell began, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Your genetic profile represents a potentially revolutionary discovery in longevity research. The cellular markers we've identified could unlock treatments for age-related diseases that affect millions of Americans. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. Doc, I appreciate the fancy words, but what exactly are you asking me to do? Participate in our comprehensive study, regular blood work, genetic sequencing, monitoring of your health markers over time. In exchange, we're prepared to offer $500,000 in compensation, plus coverage of all your medical expenses for life. The number hung in the air like a winning lottery ticket. $500,000. Frank had never seen that much money in one place, never imagined possessing such wealth. It was enough to secure Maggie's future, to give her the wedding she deserved, to buy Tom the garage expansion he'd been dreaming about. But something in Dr. Hartwell's tone set off alarm bells in Frank's mind, the same instincts that had kept him alive in Vietnam when officers spoke with too much enthusiasm about missions that seemed too easy. "What's the catch?" he asked. Dr. Hartwell's smile never wavered. "The procedures are minimally invasive, but they are experimental. We'll need to monitor you closely, possibly relocate you to our research facility for extended periods. There's a small risk of complications, but the potential benefits to humanity are extraordinary." Maggie spoke up, her nursing training helping her cut through the medical jargon. "What kind of complications?" "Standard research risks," Dr. Hartwell replied smoothly. "Temporary discomfort, possible allergic reactions to contrast agents, minor surgical procedures for tissue sampling." Frank caught the way she avoided eye contact when discussing risks, the practiced delivery that suggested this wasn't her first recruitment pitch. "How many other people are in this study?" "You would be our primary subject. Your genetic profile is unique." The admission sent chills through Frank's body. Primary subject. Guinea pig was the phrase that came to mind, though he kept it to himself. He'd seen enough movies about medical experiments gone wrong to know that being unique wasn't always a blessing. "I need time to think about this," Frank said. "Of course. But I should mention that we have a limited window for enrollment. Our funding is time-sensitive, and if we can't begin the study within the next week, we may have to wait another year for the next funding cycle." After the researchers left, Frank's house felt different, smaller, invaded by possibilities that were both thrilling and terrifying. Tom arrived for dinner with a bottle of wine they couldn't afford, his excitement barely contained. $500,000, Frank. You could buy 10 houses with that money." "It's not about the money," Frank said, though even he didn't believe his own words. "The hell it's not," Maggie snapped, surprising them both with her vehemence. "Dad, I've been watching you count pennies for groceries while I calculate whether we can afford your blood pressure medication this month. This could solve everything." But as the weekend progressed, Frank's unease grew. Dr. Hartwell called twice daily with new incentives, increased compensation, better living arrangements at the research facility, even job opportunities for Maggie in their medical program. Each sweetened offer made Frank more suspicious of what they weren't telling him. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Mitchell appeared at their door, out of uniform, looking exhausted and conflicted. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I need to speak with you privately. What I'm about to tell you could cost me my job." They sat in Frank's living room while Maggie made coffee, the doctor's discomfort palpable. "The University of Michigan team contacted me after your meeting. They've offered Detroit General a substantial grant if we refer suitable patients to their program. I want you to understand that my recommendation carries incentives that may not be in your best interest." Frank's blood pressure spiked. "Are you saying this whole thing is about money?" "I'm saying the line between medical research and medical exploitation can be very thin. Dr. Hartwell's team has a reputation for aggressive recruitment tactics. Their last major study involved elderly subjects with rare genetic markers. 3 participants died during experimental procedures. Maggie nearly dropped her coffee cup. 3 people died? The deaths were ruled unrelated to the research, but the families were required to sign confidentiality agreements as part of their compensation packages. I can't prove anything, but my instincts are telling me to be very careful. Frank felt the familiar weight of being caught between impossible choices. Accept the research and risk unknown dangers, or refuse and face financial ruin fighting cancer with inadequate resources. Either path led through a minefield of uncertainty. What would you do, Doc, if it was your father? Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. I'd get a second opinion. From someone who isn't being paid by the university, who doesn't have financial incentives clouding their judgment. There's an oncologist in Ann Arbor, Dr. James Patterson. He's retired from active practice but still consults on unusual cases. He owes me a favor. Monday morning brought another complication. The local newspaper had picked up Frank's story, running a front-page article titled, "Local Veteran Fights Cancer and Medical Costs." The reporter had somehow accessed the GoFundMe page and interviewed several donors, turning Frank's private medical crisis into public entertainment. Frank read the article with growing horror. They'd described him as a proud veteran reduced to begging for medical care, painting him as a symbol of America's healthcare failures. Neighbors who'd never spoken to him before began stopping by with casseroles and unsolicited advice. The attention felt like having his dignity stripped away in public. "I can't do this," he told Maggie after the 4th well-meaning visitor left. "I can't be poster boy for everybody's sad story about getting old in America." But the media attention brought unexpected developments. A law firm specializing in insurance disputes contacted them, offering to represent Frank pro bono in exchange for the publicity. A medical advocacy group reached out with resources for fighting insurance denials. Most surprisingly, 2 other families contacted them through the newspaper, claiming similar genetic patterns and insurance problems. Dr. Patterson's consultation on Wednesday provided the clarity Frank desperately needed. The retired oncologist examined the pathology reports with the methodical patience of someone no longer rushing between appointments. "This isn't typical melanoma," he concluded after 2 hours of analysis. "The cellular characteristics suggest a benign genetic variant that's been misclassified. I've seen 3 similar cases in my 40-year career, all in families with documented longevity patterns." Frank's relief was overwhelming. "So I'm not dying?" "Not from this. But Mr. O'Sullivan, I'm concerned about the research proposal you've received. Dr. Hartwell's team has a history of overstating benefits and understating risks. The compensation they're offering suggests they believe your genetic profile is extremely valuable, possibly more valuable than they're admitting." The revelation changed everything. Frank wasn't dying of cancer, but he was carrying something rare enough to make him a target for medical researchers with questionable ethics. The $500,000 wasn't generosity. It was payment for something they wanted badly enough to risk his life to obtain. That evening, Frank called Dr. Ann Hartwell to decline participation in the study. Her reaction was immediate and telling. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I think you're making a serious mistake. Without proper monitoring, you can't be certain about your diagnosis. Our research program offers the best possible medical care." "Doc, I've been getting by without the best possible medical care my whole life. I think I'll manage a while longer." The pressure didn't stop there. Dr. Hartwell's team began calling daily, each conversation escalating the urgency. They cited new research findings, increased compensation offers, even implied threats about the progression of his condition without their intervention. Frank felt like a man being hunted, his phone ringing constantly with calls he refused to answer. The stress began affecting his health in ways the mole never had. He lost weight, couldn't sleep, jumped at unexpected sounds. Maggie watched him deteriorate with growing alarm, caught between relief that he wasn't dying of cancer and new fears about what the research pressure was doing to him. Tom returned Thursday evening with an apology and a revelation. "I talked to my buddy who works security at University of Michigan Medical Center. That Dr. Hartwell? She's been put on administrative leave twice for ethics violations. Her research subjects have a higher complication rate than any other team at the university." The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture that terrified Frank more than cancer had. He wasn't a patient. He was a commodity. His genetic rarity made him valuable enough for people to lie, manipulate, and pressure him into decisions that could kill him. Friday brought the final pressure tactic. Dr. Hartwell appeared at their door unannounced, accompanied by 2 assistants and a briefcase full of contracts. "Mr. O'Sullivan, we've increased our offer to $750,000. This is our final offer, and it expires at midnight tonight." Frank looked at the woman standing in his living room, seeing her clearly for the first time. Behind the professional demeanor and expensive clothes was someone who viewed him as a means to an end, a stepping stone to research glory and financial success. "Ma'am," he said with the quiet dignity he'd carried through decades of hard work and harder times, "I think it's time for you to leave my house." The confrontation that followed revealed Dr. Hartwell's true nature. She alternated between threats about his medical condition and promises of wealth, her desperation growing more obvious with each rejected offer. When Frank finally closed the door on her, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of making a choice based on his own judgment rather than his circumstances. But the relief was short-lived. That night, lying in bed listening to February wind rattle the windows, Frank wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. $750,000 would have secured Maggie's future, given Tom the resources to expand his business, maybe even saved other people through medical research. The mole on his back seemed to throb with the weight of consequences he couldn't fully understand. The call came at 3 a.m. on Saturday, jolting Frank from restless sleep with the kind of urgency that meant someone was dying. Maggie's phone buzzed against the nightstand, and Frank heard her fumbling in the darkness, her voice thick with sleep and growing alarm. "This is Margaret O'Sullivan." "What? When did this happen?" Frank sat up, his arthritis forgotten in the face of something that sounded like disaster. Maggie's face, illuminated by the phone's glow, went pale as winter moonlight. "We'll be right there," she whispered, and Frank knew their fragile world had just shattered again. Dr. Mitchell met them in the emergency department at Detroit General, still in scrubs from what had clearly been a long night. Her expression carried the weight of someone delivering news that would change everything. "The pathology lab made an error," she said without preamble, "a significant error. When they reran your biopsy using more comprehensive testing, they discovered that the initial cancer diagnosis was wrong. But Mr. O'Sullivan, what they found instead is complicated." Frank's relief lasted exactly 3 seconds before Dr. Mitchell's next words hit him like a sledgehammer. "You have a rare genetic condition called familial atypical multiple mole melanoma syndrome. It's hereditary. And while the moles themselves aren't immediately dangerous, people with this condition have a 90% chance of developing pancreatic cancer before age 75. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank was 78. He'd already beaten the odds by 3 years, but the sword of Damocles was still hanging over his head. Worse yet, if it was hereditary. "Maggie needs to be tested immediately," Dr. Mitchell continued, "and any other family members. This condition often skips generations, but when it appears, it's almost always fatal without early intervention." Maggie's hand found Frank's, but her grip was weak, trembling. "How early is early intervention?" "Ideally, we catch it in the 20s or 30s, at 45. Dr. Mitchell's pause spoke volumes. We need to run tests immediately. If you've inherited the gene, we may already be fighting against time. The genetic testing took 3 days that felt like 3 years. Frank watched his daughter try to maintain her composure while facing the possibility that his DNA had signed her death warrant. She moved through their house like a ghost, touching familiar objects as if memorizing them, spending long hours staring at photographs of her mother. Tom's reaction was immediate and fierce. "We're getting married next week," he announced Tuesday evening, his voice carrying an urgency Frank had never heard before. "If Maggie's got this thing, if time's running out, I'm not wasting another day pretending we can wait for the perfect moment." "Tom, we can't plan a wedding when we don't even know if I'm going to be alive next year," Maggie protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "That's exactly when we should plan a wedding," Tom shot back. "Maggie, I've been waiting 2 years for you to be ready. Your dad's not dying of cancer, but that doesn't mean we should keep putting our lives on hold." Frank watched the exchange with growing dread. His condition, whatever it was, had become a cancer of a different kind, eating away at his daughter's happiness, destroying Tom's patience, poisoning the future he'd wanted to secure for them. Wednesday brought worse news. The insurance company, upon learning of the genetic diagnosis, retroactively denied coverage for all of Frank's recent medical care. Pre-existing condition, they claimed, despite the fact that the condition had been unknown until 3 days ago. The medical bills that had seemed manageable when spread over time suddenly demanded immediate payment. $47,000 for testing, consultations, and procedures. "They can do that?" Frank asked Janet, the hospital social worker who looked like she'd aged a decade since their first meeting. "Unfortunately, yes. Genetic conditions fall into a gray area of coverage, especially when they're newly identified. You can appeal, but that process takes months, and the hospital needs payment within 30 days or they'll send the account to collections." The foreclosure notice arrived that same afternoon, hand-delivered by a sheriff's deputy who apologized as he handed Frank the papers. The bank had lost patience with their financial juggling act. They had 60 days to pay the overdue mortgage or lose the house Patricia had loved. Maggie's test results came Thursday morning. She carried the gene. Not only did she carry it, but blood work showed elevated markers, suggesting the pancreatic cancer process had already begun. Dr. Mitchell's recommendation was immediate surgery, a Whipple procedure that would remove part of her pancreas, followed by aggressive chemotherapy. "The surgery alone cost $60,000, Dr. Mitchell explained with the weariness of someone who'd delivered too much bad news. "With chemotherapy, we're looking at close to $200,000. Insurance will cover some of it, but with your employment situation..." Frank felt his world collapse completely. Not only was he facing his own mortality, but his genetic legacy was going to kill his daughter. The GoFundMe page, which had raised $12,000 for his cancer treatment, seemed laughably inadequate for the medical catastrophe they now faced. That evening, Frank made the hardest phone call of his life. "Dr. Hartwell, this is Frank O'Sullivan." "About that research program?" "Mr. O'Sullivan, I'm so glad you reconsidered. We can have contracts ready by tomorrow. I need to know something first. If I participate in your study, if something happens to me, will you help my daughter? She's got the same condition, and she needs surgery." Dr. Hartwell's pause was telling. "Our research focus is on your specific genetic markers, Mr. O'Sullivan. We're not equipped to provide clinical treatment for family members." Frank hung up feeling more alone than he had since Patricia died. The research team wanted to study him like a lab rat, but they had no interest in saving his daughter. The insurance company wanted to deny coverage based on genetics they couldn't control. The medical system wanted payment they couldn't provide. Friday brought a surprise visitor that changed everything. Pastor Williams arrived with Danny O'Sullivan, Frank's nephew from Toledo, and a folder full of documents that looked like legal papers. "Uncle Frank," Danny said, settling his 6-foot frame into Patricia's old chair, "I've been doing some digging into this insurance situation. That company that's denying your claims, they've been doing the same thing to families across the Midwest. Genetic discrimination, systematically denying coverage to people with hereditary conditions." Danny spread the papers across the coffee table. Case studies, court documents, newspaper articles about families destroyed by insurance practices that seem designed to profit from human suffering. "There's a class action lawsuit being filed," Pastor Williams explained. 17 families so far, all with similar stories. The law firm thinks they can prove systematic discrimination, maybe even fraud. Frank studied the documents, seeing his own story reflected in the experiences of strangers. Elderly people denied coverage, families forced into bankruptcy, lives destroyed by corporate policies that treated human DNA like a liability to be managed, rather than a reality to be addressed. "What would I have to do?" "Be the lead plaintiff," Danny said. "Tell your story publicly. Let the lawyers use your case as the foundation for the lawsuit. It's risky. Insurance companies fight dirty, and they'll try to destroy your credibility. But if we win, we could change how genetic conditions are covered for millions of people," Pastor Williams finished. "Your suffering could prevent other families from going through the same hell." The decision felt impossibly heavy. Frank had spent his life avoiding attention, working hard and keeping his head down. Now he was being asked to become the public face of a battle against corporate power, to expose his private medical crisis to strangers who would judge his choices and his character. That night, lying in bed with Maggie's worried breathing audible through the thin walls, Frank made his choice. Not for the money, not for the recognition, but for the other families who would face similar crossroads in years to come. Saturday morning, he called Danny with his decision. "I'll do it, but I want something in return. Win or lose, that law firm helps Maggie get the treatment she needs. I don't care what it costs me." The next week transformed their quiet house into the epicenter of a legal storm. Lawyers arrived with recording equipment and stenographers, documenting every detail of Frank's medical journey. Reporters called requesting interviews. Medical experts offered opinions about genetic discrimination that Frank barely understood. Through it all, Maggie's condition continued to deteriorate. The elevated cancer markers in her blood climbed steadily, each lab result bringing them closer to an emergency that couldn't wait for lawsuits to resolve. Dr. Mitchell recommended immediate surgery, but without insurance approval or upfront payment, no hospital would schedule the procedure. Frank watched his daughter grow thinner and paler each day, knowing that his genetic legacy was slowly killing her, while lawyers debated the finer points of discrimination law. The irony was devastating. He'd been granted additional years of life through some quirk of DNA, but that same quirk was stealing time from the person he loved most. Tom's patience finally snapped on Friday evening. "This is insane," he exploded, slamming his fist on the kitchen table hard enough to rattle the salt and pepper shakers. "Maggie's dying while we wait for justice. I'm selling my garage, cashing out my retirement fund, whatever it takes. We're not losing her to prove a point about insurance companies." Frank felt his heart break watching Tom's desperation, seeing the same helpless rage he'd carried through months of impossible choices. "Son, I can't let you destroy your life for us." "You can't stop me," Tom replied with quiet determination. "I love her, Frank. I'd rather be broke and married to her than rich and watching her die because we were too proud to act." The conversation was interrupted by Maggie's collapse in the living room, her body finally succumbing to the stress and advancing disease. As Frank held his unconscious daughter, waiting for the ambulance that would bring more bills they couldn't pay, He realized that all their fighting about money and pride and genetic justice meant nothing if she died while they debated principles. The mole that had started this nightmare seemed to pulse on his back, a reminder that sometimes salvation and destruction came wrapped in the same package. The ambulance ride to Detroit General felt like a journey through purgatory. Maggie's pale face illuminated by the strobing lights as paramedics worked to stabilize her blood pressure. Frank held her hand, feeling how fragile she'd become, how the weight had melted off her frame while he'd been obsessing over insurance forms and legal battles. In the chaos of sirens and medical equipment, one thought crystallized with brutal clarity. He'd been so focused on fighting the system that he'd nearly lost sight of what actually mattered. Dr. Mitchell met them at the emergency entrance, her face grim but determined. "We're taking her straight to surgery. I've spoken with administration. They're going to treat first and worry about payment later." She paused, meeting Frank's eyes. "There's something else. Dr. Patterson called with additional findings about your case. Frank, we need to talk after Maggie's stable." The surgery waiting room became Frank's purgatory for the next 6 hours. Tom paced like a caged animal, his mechanic's hands clenched into fists that had no enemy to fight. Mrs. Chen appeared with sandwiches no one could eat and sat in stoic silence, her presence more comforting than any words could have been. Danny drove up from Toledo with a carload of relatives Frank hadn't seen in years, the O'Sullivan clan gathering like they had for Patricia's funeral. Pastor Williams led prayers that felt more like negotiations with God than worship. Frank found himself making bargains with the universe. Take his remaining years, take the house, take everything, just let Maggie live to see 46. When Dr. Mitchell finally emerged from the surgical suite, her expression was unreadable. "The surgery went well. We removed the affected tissue and several lymph nodes for testing. But Frank, I need to speak with you privately about what Dr. Patterson discovered." They found a quiet corner in the hospital chapel, its stained glass windows casting colored shadows across worn pews. Dr. Mitchell carried a manila folder thick with documents and what appeared to be very old medical records. "Your grandfather's military service records contained more than we initially realized," she began, pulling out photocopied pages that looked decades old. "Thomas O'Sullivan wasn't just a long-lived man with unusual skin markings. He was part of a classified medical study conducted by the Army between 1943 and 1968. Frank's blood ran cold. "What kind of study?" "Longevity research. The military was investigating families with documented patterns of extended lifespans, trying to understand what made some soldiers more resilient than others. Your grandfather was monitored for 25 years, his medical data collected and analyzed by government researchers." The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. "You're saying the government knew about our family? That they've been watching us?" "Not actively watching, but your genetic profile has been in government databases for decades. When you applied for Medicare, when you received VA benefits, when Maggie got her nursing license, all of that data was flagged because of your family's participation in the original study." Dr. Mitchell pulled out another document, this one more recent. "The insurance company that's been denying your claims, they have contracts with government agencies to access genetic databases for risk assessment. They knew about your family's genetic markers before you ever filed a claim." Frank felt rage building in his chest, hot and pure. "They knew this whole time? They knew we had this condition, and they sold us insurance anyway, planning to deny coverage when we needed it. It's worse than that. The University of Michigan research team, Dr. Hartwell, has government contracts too. They weren't offering to study you out of scientific curiosity. They were trying to complete research that began with your grandfather 70 years ago." The revelation hit Frank like a tsunami of betrayal. He wasn't just fighting an insurance company or greedy researchers. He was battling a system that had been manipulating his family for 3 generations. His grandfather's long life hadn't been a blessing. It had been a target painted on the O'Sullivan family tree. "There's more," Dr. Mitchell continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "The genetic condition you and Maggie carry, it's not familial atypical multiple mole melanoma syndrome. Dr. Patterson consulted with geneticists at Johns Hopkins. What you have is a documented longevity variant that's been studied in only 12 families worldwide. The moles are just a visible marker, like a genetic signature." Frank's head spun with the implications. "So Maggie, she's not dying of pancreatic cancer? The elevated markers in her blood are stress-related, possibly exacerbated by months of caring for you while worrying about finances. With proper treatment and stress reduction, she should make a full recovery. But Frank, there's something else you need to know about this genetic variant." Dr. Mitchell's hesitation told Frank he wasn't going to like what came next. "People with your genetic profile don't just live longer. They often experience improved health in their later years. Your grandfather's military records show that his physical condition actually improved after age 70. The arthritis that's been bothering you, the fatigue, the memory issues, those might start reversing as the genetic expression changes." Frank stared at her in disbelief. "You're saying I might get better? At my age?" "It's possible. The families in the original studies showed remarkable health improvements in their 70s and 80s. But here's what the government and the insurance companies don't want you to know. This genetic variant is extremely valuable for pharmaceutical research. The longevity mechanisms could be worth billions in drug development." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Frank wasn't just a patient or even a research subject, he was intellectual property. His DNA represented potential profits so enormous that corporations and government agencies were willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate to control it. "What do I do with this information?" Frank asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of deception that surrounded his family. "You fight back. The journalist who's been investigating your case, Rebecca Torres, she's uncovered documents showing systematic genetic discrimination affecting hundreds of families. Your case could be the keystone that brings down the entire system." That evening, as Maggie recovered from surgery in a hospital room they couldn't afford, Frank sat with Rebecca Torres in the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of institutional coffee and the quiet desperation of families facing medical crises. Rebecca was younger than Maggie, but her eyes carried the sharp intelligence of someone who'd made a career of exposing uncomfortable truths. "Mr. O'Sullivan, what I'm about to show you will make you angry. Are you prepared for that?" She opened her laptop, revealing emails between insurance executives discussing Frank's case. The language was clinical, dehumanizing, referring to him as subject 47 inches and discussing acceptable loss ratios for genetic discrimination claims. "They never intended to pay your claims," Rebecca explained. "Your family's genetic profile was flagged the moment you applied for coverage. They calculated that it was more profitable to collect premiums for several years and then deny coverage when you got sick, knowing that most elderly patients wouldn't have the resources to fight them legally." Frank read email after email, each one revealing new layers of calculated cruelty. Insurance executives joking about genetic undesirables, government officials discussing the commercial value of longevity research, pharmaceutical companies bidding on access to rare genetic profiles. "How many other families?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've identified 47 cases in the past 5 years. Families with rare genetic traits who were systematically targeted for insurance fraud. Most of them lost everything. Their homes, their savings, sometimes their lives because they couldn't afford treatment." The weight of representing those families felt enormous. Frank had never wanted to be a symbol or a spokesman, but the alternative was allowing the system to continue destroying innocent people for profit. "What happens if I do this? If I become your lead plaintiff?" Rebecca's expression was honest and unflinching. They'll try to destroy you. They'll investigate every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to discredit your story. They'll claim you're motivated by greed, that you're exploiting the system. They have unlimited resources and no conscience about how they use them. Frank thought about Maggie lying upstairs, recovering from surgery that had been unnecessary, suffering from a condition that was manageable if treated properly. He thought about Tom, exhausting his savings to pay for medical care that should have been covered by insurance they'd faithfully paid for years. He thought about the 46 other families facing similar nightmares. What do I need to sign? The lawsuit filing made national news within hours. Genetic discrimination exposed in landmark case ran as the headline in major newspapers, with Frank's photograph, a proud veteran standing beside his modest Detroit home, becoming the face of healthcare injustice in America. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Frank's phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering support, and strangers sharing their own stories of insurance betrayal. The GoFundMe page exploded overnight, raising $50,000 from people who saw Frank's fight as their own. But the enemy struck back with equal force. By Monday morning, private investigators were interviewing Frank's neighbors, digging through his military service records, questioning his financial history. Someone leaked his Social Security number, forcing him to freeze his credit. Anonymous phone calls threatened legal action if he didn't withdraw from the lawsuit. The pressure was designed to break him, to make him choose between his privacy and his principles. Frank had seen similar tactics in Vietnam. Psychological warfare meant to destroy morale before the real battle began. Tuesday brought the most devastating attack yet. A news report suggested that Frank was exploiting his condition for financial gain, that his medical crisis was exaggerated to generate sympathy donations. The story included interviews with medical experts who questioned the validity of his genetic diagnosis and implied that the entire lawsuit was a money-grabbing scheme. Frank watched his reputation be torn apart on live television, his lifetime of honest work reduced to a punchline about greedy seniors gaming the healthcare system. The comments section under online articles was particularly brutal. Strangers calling him a fraud, a scammer, a dying old man trying to get rich off his misery. The assault on his character was working. Several families withdrew from the class action lawsuit, afraid of similar public humiliation. The GoFundMe donations slowed to a trickle as doubt crept into public perception of Frank's story. That night, sitting in his kitchen where he'd started each morning for 45 years, Frank seriously considered abandoning the fight. The cost of justice was proving higher than he'd ever imagined, and the victory was far from guaranteed. 6 months after that terrifying phone call in the middle of the night, Frank O'Sullivan stood in the marble lobby of the federal courthouse in Detroit, watching his lawyer shake hands with representatives from the insurance company that had tried to destroy his family. The settlement check in his jacket pocket, $2.8 million for his individual case, plus guaranteed coverage for Maggie's ongoing medical care, felt surreal after so many months of counting pennies for groceries. The class action lawsuit had exceeded everyone's expectations. 47 families received compensation totaling $85 million, and more importantly, the case had forced new federal regulations requiring genetic non-discrimination clauses in all health insurance policies. Frank's willingness to endure public scrutiny had created protections that would shield future generations from the corporate predators who treated human DNA like a commodity to be exploited. Mr. O'Sullivan. Rebecca Torres approached with her familiar notebook and the smile that had become genuine friendship over months of working together. How does it feel to be the man who changed healthcare law in America? Frank adjusted his new suit, the first one he'd owned since Patricia's funeral, and considered the question. Feels like I got lucky, mostly. Lucky to have a daughter stubborn enough to drag me to the doctor, lucky to have people who wouldn't let me give up when things got bad. The courthouse steps were crowded with other families from the lawsuit, their faces showing the same mixture of relief and disbelief that Frank felt. These were ordinary people who'd been caught in an extraordinary battle against corporate power, and somehow they'd won. Not just the money, though that was life-changing for families who'd been drowning in medical debt. They'd won the principle that genetic information couldn't be weaponized against vulnerable people. Doctor Mitchell appeared through the crowd, no longer the exhausted physician Frank had first met, but a woman energized by purpose. Frank, I wanted to tell you personally, Detroit General received a $15 million research grant to establish a genetic medicine center. Your case created awareness that's bringing resources to communities that desperately need them. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. The medical condition he'd feared would bankrupt him had instead become the foundation for improving health care in his community. Detroit General, which had been scheduled for closure, was now expanding its services and hiring additional staff. The neighborhood clinic where he'd first been examined was receiving funding for equipment upgrades and patient assistance programs. Tom appeared beside them, his arm around Maggie's waist, both of them wearing the satisfied exhaustion of people who'd survived a war. Maggie's recovery had been remarkable once the stress-related symptoms were properly addressed, and her genuine health concerns were separated from the misdiagnosis that had sent their lives into chaos. The surgery she'd undergone had been minor compared to what they'd feared, removing some precancerous tissue but leaving her fundamentally healthy. "You ready for this afternoon?" Tom asked, grinning with the excitement of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. Frank nodded, touching the small box in his pocket. Today wasn't just about legal victories. It was about family celebrations too long delayed. Tom and Maggie's wedding was finally happening, a small ceremony in Pastor Williams' church with the people who'd stood by them through the darkest months of their lives. The reception was held in the community center that had been Mrs. Chen's idea, a converted auto plant space that now served as a gathering place for neighborhood events. Long tables were covered with potluck dishes that told the story of Detroit's diversity. Polish pierogi from the Kowalski family, Mexican tamales from the Gonzalez clan, soul food from the Baptist church down the street, and Mrs. Chen's famous dumplings that had sustained Frank through so many difficult days. Frank's speech as father of the bride was brief but heartfelt. 6 months ago, I thought I was dying and taking my daughter's future with me. Today, I'm watching her marry a man who proved that love means showing up when things get hard. Tom, you didn't just win my daughter's heart, you helped save our family when we couldn't save ourselves. The applause was warm and genuine, but Frank's attention was drawn to an unexpected guest sitting in the back row. Dr. Hartwell had appeared without invitation, her expensive suit standing out among the working-class crowd like a corporate infiltrator at a family gathering. After the ceremony, she approached Frank with what appeared to be genuine contrition. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I owe you an apology. When the university investigated our research practices following your lawsuit, they discovered that I'd been overly aggressive in my recruitment methods. I lost sight of patient welfare in pursuit of research goals." Frank studied her face, seeing something that hadn't been there during their earlier encounters: humility, perhaps even shame. "What happens now, Doc?" "I've been reassigned to teaching duties. No more patient recruitment, no more research with human subjects. The university has implemented new oversight protocols to prevent the kind of pressure we put on you and your family." Frank felt no satisfaction in her professional downfall. Dr. Hartwell was ambitious and had made serious ethical mistakes, but she wasn't evil, just someone who'd lost her way in a system that rewarded results over humanity. "I hope you learned something from all this," Frank said finally. "People aren't lab rats, no matter how interesting their DNA might be." The celebration continued into the evening, but Frank found himself stepping outside for air, needing a moment away from the joy that felt almost too much to bear after months of crisis. Mrs. Chen joined him on the community center steps, her small frame bundled in a coat that had probably been expensive when she bought it 30 years ago. "You know what I think?" she said in her careful English, words chosen with the precision of someone for whom language was still a daily negotiation. "I think your wife, Patricia, she was watching over you this whole time, making sure you found the right people to help when you needed them most." Frank considered this, looking up at the Detroit skyline where a few lights still glowed in buildings that hadn't been abandoned yet. Maybe so. Sometimes I feel like she's still here, still trying to take care of us. Inside, Danny was entertaining the crowd with stories about their grandfather Thomas, pulling out photographs and letters that painted a picture of a man who'd lived through the Depression, 2 wars, and the rise and fall of Detroit's automotive empire. The genetic variant that had caused so much fear was revealed as just another chapter in a family story of resilience and survival. Grandpa Tom always said the O'Sullivans were too stubborn to die young, Danny told the wedding guests. Looks like he was right, but he forgot to mention we're also too stubborn to let anybody push us around. The laughter that followed felt healing, transforming months of medical terror into family legend. Frank realized that his story would be told at future O'Sullivan gatherings, becoming part of the oral history that connected generations. Dr. Mitchell found Frank as the evening wound down, carrying news that felt like the final piece of a very complicated puzzle. The pathology results from Maggie's surgery came back clean. No cancer, no precancerous changes, just some inflammation that's already responding to treatment. And Frank, your latest blood work shows something remarkable. What's that, Doc? Your arthritis markers have decreased significantly. Your cardiovascular function has improved. The genetic expression that Dr. Patterson predicted seems to be happening. Your health is actually getting better. Frank absorbed this information slowly, understanding that he was living through a medical phenomenon that researchers would study for decades. How much better? It's hard to predict, but based on your grandfather's records and the patterns we're seeing in your cellular function, you could have 20 or 30 good years ahead of you. Active, healthy years. The prospect of 2 or 3 more decades of life felt overwhelming rather than joyful. Frank had spent so many months preparing to die that the idea of an extended future required complete mental reorganization. What did a 78-year-old man do with the unexpected gift of time? Tom and Maggie appeared beside him, Tom's arm around his new wife's waist, both of them glowing with the happiness of people who'd survived a storm and found themselves on solid ground. "Dad," Maggie said, using the tone she'd employed since childhood when she had something important to say, "Tom and I have been talking. We want to buy a house big enough for all of us. Use some of the settlement money to create a real home where you can age in place without worrying about finances." Frank's first instinct was to protest, to insist on his independence, but the events of recent months had taught him that pride could be its own form of selfishness. "You sure you want an old man cluttering up your newlywed nest?" Tom grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face into something boyish. "Frank, I've been trying to marry into this family for 2 years. You think I'm going to let you escape now?" The drive home in Tom's truck felt different than all their previous journeys to and from medical appointments. This time, they were returning not as patients or supplicants, but as victors who'd faced down a system designed to crush them and emerged stronger. Frank's house looked the same from the outside, the same wraparound porch where Patricia had grown her tomatoes, the same oak tree in the front yard where Maggie had learned to climb, but everything had changed. The foreclosure notice had been replaced with a paid-in-full mortgage document. The pile of medical bills had been replaced with letters from grateful families whose insurance claims were now being honored because of the lawsuit's success. Mrs. Chen was waiting on the porch with a thermos of tea and the patient smile of someone who'd known this story would end well long before anyone else believed it. "You see," she said as Frank climbed the steps, "sometimes God makes us wait because the blessing is bigger than we can imagine." Sunday morning brought a new ritual. Instead of reading obituaries first, Frank started with the good news: birth announcements, wedding announcements, stories of people beginning rather than ending. The shift felt symbolic of something larger, a choice to focus on possibilities rather than limitations. Maggie and Tom had spent the night in their old respective homes, Tom's apartment above his garage, Maggie in her childhood bedroom, maintaining tradition even as they planned their future together. They appeared for breakfast, wearing the contentment of people who'd earned their happiness through surviving something that should have destroyed them. "I've been thinking," Frank announced over Mrs. Chen's pancakes and Danny's strong coffee. "This settlement money, it's more than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. Maybe it's time to do something useful with it." The O'Sullivan Family Foundation was established the following month, dedicated to helping families navigate genetic discrimination and insurance denial. Frank's first official act as foundation president was writing a check to cover medical expenses for 3 families whose cases were still working through the legal system. The foundation operated out of a restored storefront in Frank's neighborhood, providing free advocacy services and emergency financial assistance to families facing medical crises. Maggie managed daily operations while completing her degree in health administration, her experience with the healthcare system making her a fierce advocate for patients' rights. Tom expanded his garage into a training center for unemployed auto workers, teaching mechanical skills while also providing information about healthcare advocacy and workers' rights. The integration of practical skills with social justice education created a model that was replicated in similar communities across the Rust Belt. Pastor Williams Church became the unofficial headquarters for medical advocacy in Detroit, its basement meeting rooms hosting support groups for families fighting insurance companies and educational workshops about genetic rights. The congregation, once focused primarily on spiritual matters, discovered that fighting for health care justice was its own form of ministry. Dr. Mitchell left Detroit General to join the faculty at University of Michigan, where she established new protocols for ethical genetic research and patient advocacy. Her first published paper, co-authored with Dr. Patterson, documented the O'Sullivan case as a model for identifying and protecting patients with rare genetic variants. A year later, Frank celebrated his 79th birthday, not with the quiet resignation he'd expected, but with a house full of family and friends who'd become part of his extended clan. The genetic improvements Dr. Mitchell had predicted were proving accurate. His arthritis had virtually disappeared, his energy levels rivaled those of men 20 years younger, and his memory was sharper than it had been in years. The mole on his back had stabilized, no longer the terrifying unknown that had started their journey, but a reminder of how quickly life could change, and how important it was to face those changes with courage and community support. Maggie and Tom's first anniversary party was held in the same community center where they'd been married, but the space was transformed. What had once been a simple neighborhood gathering place was now a thriving center for social services, job training, and community organizing. The O'Sullivan Foundation's success had attracted additional funding from foundations and government grants, creating a sustainable model for community-based healthcare advocacy. Frank's daily routine now included morning coffee with a purpose, reviewing foundation applications, reading letters from families they'd helped, planning new initiatives to expand their reach. The obituaries still got read, but they no longer felt like previews of his own fate. The house where he'd once counted heating bills and rationed groceries had been renovated into a multi-generational home where 3 adults lived in comfortable harmony. Patricia's garden was restored and expanded, with Tom adding raised beds that made it easier for Frank to tend the vegetables that had always connected him to his wife's memory. On quiet evenings, Frank would sit on the porch, where he'd once worried about property taxes and medical bills, watching his neighborhood slowly recover from decades of neglect. New families were moving into renovated houses, small businesses were opening in previously empty storefronts, and children played in streets that had been deserted just months before. The transformation wasn't just about money, though the foundation's grants had certainly helped. It was about hope, the infectious kind that spread when people saw that fighting back against impossible odds could actually work. Mrs. Chen joined him most evenings, her presence a constant in his life that had become precious beyond measure. They'd developed a ritual of sharing tea and comfortable silence, two survivors who'd learned that community was the best insurance against life's uncertainties. "You know what I learned from all this?" Frank said one evening as autumn painted the neighborhood in shades of gold and red. "Tell me," Mrs. Chen replied, settling her small frame into Patricia's old rocking chair. "I learned that getting old doesn't mean getting powerless. Sometimes it means getting just ornery enough to stand up to people who think they can push you around because you're not as fast as you used to be." 5 years later, Frank at 83 was still healthy, still active, still fighting for families who faced genetic discrimination. The O'Sullivan Research Center at Detroit General had helped over 10,000 families navigate insurance challenges and genetic counseling. Maggie had completed her master's degree in health administration and was being courted by national healthcare advocacy organizations. Tom's garage had become a model for worker retraining programs, combining practical skills with social justice education in ways that were being studied by labor organizers across the country. His marriage to Maggie had produced twin daughters who carried the O'Sullivan genetic variant, a legacy that was now understood as a gift rather than a curse. The morning routine remained the same: coffee at 5 o'clock, strong and black. But Frank's newspaper reading had evolved. He still checked the obituaries, but now he also read the birth announcements and wedding notices, the scholarship awards and business openings. Detroit was coming back to life, one small victory at a time, and Frank had played a part in that resurrection. Mrs. Chen still appeared most mornings with breakfast and wisdom earned through 8 decades of navigating life's complexities. At 87, she moved more slowly, but remained the neighborhood's unofficial diplomat, solving disputes and organizing support for families in crisis. Danny had moved back from Toledo, drawn by the foundation's success and the opportunity to be part of something larger than individual survival. He managed the foundation's financial operations with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to corporate accounting, ensuring that every dollar served families who needed help rather than administrative overhead. Pastor Williams's church had become a pilgrimage destination for healthcare activists, its basement meeting rooms hosting conferences and strategy sessions that influenced policy at state and national levels. The congregation had quadrupled in size, drawn not just by spiritual needs, but by the practical support the church provided for families navigating medical crises. The house itself had become a symbol of what was possible when communities rallied around their vulnerable members. Tour groups occasionally requested visits, wanting to see where the O'Sullivan case had begun. Frank usually declined these requests, preferring privacy to publicity, but he made exceptions for families facing similar challenges who needed to see that victory was possible. On a typical Tuesday morning in his 83rd year, Frank stood in the same bathroom where Maggie had first noticed the mole that changed everything. The spot was still there, darker and more pronounced than ever, but now it felt like a badge of honor rather than a mark of doom. In the mirror, he could see the man he'd become, not just a survivor, but someone who'd transformed personal suffering into community healing. Maggie appeared in the doorway, now wearing the confident expression of someone who'd found her calling in healthcare advocacy. "Ready for today's interview, Dad?" They were meeting with a documentary filmmaker who was creating a feature about genetic discrimination and the families who'd fought back. Frank had initially resisted the attention, but Maggie had convinced him that their story could inspire other people facing similar battles. "You know what I'm going to tell them," Frank said, turning from the mirror to face his daughter. "What's that, Dad?" "I'm going to tell them that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing. That mole scared us half to death, but it led us to people and purposes we never would have found otherwise." The documentary, when it aired 9 months later, would win several awards and inspire new legislation strengthening protections for patients with genetic conditions. But that morning, Frank was simply a father grateful for the chance to see his daughter thrive. The interview took place in the community center, surrounded by photographs documenting the transformation of their neighborhood and the families who'd been helped by the foundation. Frank spoke about fear and courage, about the difference between giving up and giving in, about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice. "What advice would you give to families facing similar challenges?" the filmmaker asked. Frank considered the question, thinking about all the people who'd contacted the foundation seeking help and hope. "I'd tell them that you're not as powerless as the system wants you to believe. You've got rights, you've got community, and if you're lucky, you've got people who love you enough to fight alongside you when things get impossible." As afternoon faded into evening, Frank found himself back on his porch, watching children play in streets that were alive again with the sounds of a community healing itself. The genetic variant that had once threatened to destroy his family had instead become the foundation for rebuilding not just their lives, but their entire neighborhood. Tom and Maggie appeared with the twins, now 3 years old and carrying the O'Sullivan stubborn streak that Frank recognized from looking in mirrors for 8 decades. The girls climbed onto his lap with the fearless affection of children who'd never known a world where their grandfather wasn't strong and healthy. "Tell us the story about the magic spot, Grandpa," little Patricia demanded, pointing to Frank's back where the mole remained visible through his thin shirt. Frank smiled, settling back in his chair as the evening light painted the Detroit skyline in shades of hope. "Well, girls, it all started when your mama looked closer and froze." The story had become family legend, told and retold at gatherings where fear had been transformed into gratitude, where medical crisis had become community triumph. Frank's mole, the spot that had started as his greatest fear, had become the foundation stone of the life he'd never imagined possible. Some people collected stamps, Frank reflected, as his granddaughters listened with wide eyes to the tale of how a simple medical examination had changed their world. Frank O'Sullivan collected miracles, and he was grateful for every single one. Frank O'Sullivan's story isn't just about one family's medical nightmare. It's about every American who's ever felt helpless watching their golden years slip away to medical bills and insurance companies that profit from our pain. At 78, Frank thought a simple mole on his back would bankrupt his family and steal his daughter's future. Instead, it became the key that unlocked a fortune and exposed a system designed to exploit our most vulnerable moments. How many of us have delayed medical care because we couldn't afford the consequences? How many have watched our children sacrifice their dreams to care for us while insurance companies count their profits? Frank's courage to fight back didn't just save his family. It created legal protections for millions of Americans facing genetic discrimination. His willingness to become a public figure despite his natural privacy transformed personal suffering into community healing. The mole that terrified him became his family's salvation, proving that sometimes our greatest fears hide our most powerful opportunities. Frank discovered that being too stubborn to die young was exactly the attitude needed to take on corporate giants and win. His legacy reminds us that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. What medical fears are you avoiding because of financial concerns? Have you ever felt like the healthcare system was designed to profit from your suffering rather than heal it? Share your thoughts below. Your story matters, and together we can demand the dignity and care we've earned through a lifetime of hard work.